Stargate Voyager.
How does the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis correlate with a cataclysmic worldwide flood from the ages past?
Well, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis is gaining traction, has been gaining traction in the last few years, primarily because of Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. They have appeared several times on Joe Rogan's podcast, so that really helped to proliferate the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis all over the internet. So it's becoming quite well known, and I've been watching over the last few years. I've been watching different lectures and documentaries and reading the scientific papers, kind of tracking with the Younger Dryas and the impact hypothesis and what the ideas that people are beginning to formulate regarding how it is that the climate of planet Earth changed so drastically 12,800 years ago, and how the megafauna were extinguished overnight, basically. And that's always been a mystery. And of course, the prevailing ideology for the megafaunal extinction is what's called the overkill theory, which posits that mankind, we were these voracious hunters, and when we came across the Bering Strait, the Clovis people, and down into North America, we were just so voracious that we destroyed all of the megafaunal creatures. We basically eradicated them all just by overkill, over hunting. And that's always been a dubious theory. I always thought that was actually, it seemed idiotic, really, that these primitive hunter-gatherer people could wipe out all of the saber-toothed tigers, all of the mastodons, all of the giant sloths. It's obviously whatever happened was catastrophic enough to bring a sudden end to these animals. It was a mass extinction event, and certainly human deprivation, I'm sure, has a little part to play in that story. But it was obvious to me there was something grander going on, something that we were missing. And when the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis came along, it seemed to really fill in the blanks. Of course, Graham Hancock in his books takes the same approach, has done some great work. And as I mentioned, Randall Carlson and others, the Comet Impact research groups, doing great work. And I think that they have, at this point, really concretized their case. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, when they first came out of the gates with it, these geologists and these other scientists who've been working on this, they were ridiculed. The scientific community was rolling their eyes because they could not conceive of a comet impact 12,000 years ago. It just seemed inconceivable to them. They were also they had subscribed so intensely to the overkill theory that they were building much of their models as to how, the Clovis people disappeared and the animals, the megafauna, that this new theory just completely overturned that old theory. And so it was not widely received. It was not well received, but that was years ago. Now it's becoming, I think, based on the papers I've read and based on even some of the mainstream articles that are coming out in support of the hypothesis, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, it's sort of turning the tide. The tide is beginning to turn. I think more and more scientists are getting on board with the hypothesis. So it seemed to me and that's a very long-winded answer, but it seemed to me very important. It seemed to be an important piece of the puzzle. And the more you look into it, the more it begins to sync with all kinds of other things that people like me and you study, the megaliths and the biblical, the biblical flood narrative and the cataclysm narratives that you can find all over the world among all of the primary cultures on Earth. And it was always a question for me in terms of the biblical flood. It was always a question of A, how did it happen, and B, when did it happen? And those two questions seem to be thoroughly answered in this hypothesis. And for those who aren't familiar with the Younger Dryas, the Younger Dryas refers to an abrupt return to ice age conditions after a prolonged period of warming. And this happened between 11,600 and 12,900 roughly years ago. So we're talking somewhere between 9,600 to 10,800 BC. And and it's very well known in geology that this occurred. And it was so drastic. This is why people are trying to figure out what happened, what could have caused the climate to change so drastically. And the impact hypothesis posits that a massive comet broke up in the atmosphere or in outer space, and the Earth was bombarded with fragments of this comet. And specifically, it appears that the comet fragments collided with the North American ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet, that covered most North America, all of Canada. It was 1 mile to 2 miles thick in some places. And these comet fragments collided into this ice sheet and wreaked havoc on the Earth, obviously liquidating much of the ice sheet, instantly liquidating it, vaporizing some of it. The temperatures at ground zero of the impacts would have been equivalent to the surface of the sun. You would have had massive amounts of debris thrown up into the atmosphere, clouding up the atmosphere, falling back to the ground in black rain. You would have had extreme volcanism being set off from the impacts, wildfires, extensive biomass burning. They say in the papers up to 9 or 10% of the Earth's forests were on fire. Of the Earth's vegetation, 9 to 10% of the Earth's vegetation was consumed in these wildfires from this comet impact event. So it was an unbelievable catastrophe. Obviously, you would have had flooding, catastrophic flooding all over the Earth. Every continent would have experienced catastrophic flooding. The ocean levels would have risen precipitously, and you would have had tsunamis sweeping across islands and virtually wiping everything out in their path, and other things as well. You'd have certainly, I think most certainly, you would have had what's called an impact winter, which is very much like a nuclear winter, in which, as I previously stated, that the atmosphere would have been blanketed with this debris, this residue, both from the comet impact itself and also from the biomass burning from the smoke. So it would have darkened the sun. It would have blotted out the sun. You would have had an extended period of darkness on the Earth, months of darkness, maybe even years of darkness, perhaps not complete darkness, but long periods of dark. And so that would have thrust the world back into ice age conditions, which is exactly what happened. And so the comet impact hypothesis seems to answer all the questions. It gives us the flood of Noah. It gives us all of the other catastrophic, all of the other catastrophes, all of the other cataclysms described around the world among these ancient cultures, most of whom remember a flood, many of whom remember tidal waves, some of whom remember black rain. I believe the Hopi people the Hopi Indians in America remember the comet, actually seeing the comet. It's passed down in there. They call it a star. It's passed down in their memory, their ancestral memory. And so I've been looking for years for as I said in the beginning, the how and the when, to answer those two questions regarding the cataclysm of the Great Flood, as it's generally known all over the earth, and then of course repeated in the Sumerian tale and the Egyptian tale, and on and on.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the Egyptian tale there. That was something you mentioned in your episode video, was how the Egyptian records of legendary Atlantis seem to point to the same event. Can you hit on that real quick?
Yeah, so among these cataclysm legends that we find all over the earth, the most famous is, of course, outside of the biblical narrative, would be the Atlantean cataclysm. We all are familiar with, most of us are familiar with the story of Atlantis, which comes almost exclusively from Plato's Critias dialogue. And in the Critias dialogue, Plato is relating a conversation between Solon of Athens, his relative actually, Solon of Athens, and an old Egyptian priest of the goddess Neith from the city of Sais in Egypt. And this priest informs Solon that, first of all, he tells him that the Greeks don't have any history that's hoary with age. In other words, the Greeks are like children. Their memory does not penetrate very deeply into the past. Their records don't go back that very far. Whereas the Egyptians kept copious records that went into the deep antiquity, into deep prehistory, before the cataclysm. And the priest informed Solon that there have been many cataclysms, and then he begins to relate the story of Atlantis to Solon. And as he unfolds this story of Atlantis, he tells Solon that Atlantis, not only was Atlantis, not only do the Egyptians have a record of the destruction of Atlantis, the Egyptians have a reckoning of when Atlantis was destroyed. It was destroyed overnight in a terrible cataclysm, 9,000 years before their present age. And we know that Solon visited Egypt in 600 BC. So the Egyptian priest is saying that according to the reckoning of the ancient Egyptians, Atlantis was destroyed sometime around 9,600 BC. Now, that seems to correspond with the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. I mean, which, by the way, the dates given for the hypothesis are approximate. So you're talking somewhere between 11,600 and 12,800 years ago, or if we really want to round it off, between 12 and 13,000 years ago. And so that puts us sometime around 10,000 BC, and that's right in the neighborhood of where the Egyptians reckoned, of when the Egyptians reckoned that Atlantis was destroyed in this aqueous cataclysm. So you have this interesting synchronicity between the legend of Atlantis and the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. And I find that intriguing. Atlantis, when Atlantis was destroyed, what most people probably don't realize about the story of Atlantis, according to Plato, when Atlantis was destroyed, it wasn't this peace-loving utopia. It was an aggressive expansionist empire, and it was encroaching. It had already conquered 7 islands and held sway over 3 continents, and it was encroaching on the kingdom of Athens, according to Plato. And Athens was the only kingdom that could stand up to Atlantis, that could rebut Atlantis and hold the tide back of their conquest. And so Atlantis and Athens were locked in a bloody conflict when this cataclysm befell the earth. And both Atlantis and Athens were swept away in the waters of a great flood. So these are details that a lot of people don't realize. It's not just a cataclysm that destroyed Atlantis. It seems to be a global cataclysm, of which Atlantis was one of the victims. It was utterly destroyed in a very short period of time. And what's interesting is that the priest of Neith begins to tell the story of Atlantis to Solon by describing how the gods, the Olympian gods, had apportioned the earth amongst themselves. In other words, they divvied up the earth amongst themselves. And they chose wives from the daughters of men. And he says that Poseidon, the priest of Neith, says that Poseidon, for his part, for his allotment, he took the island of Atlantis. And he chose to wed Cleito, the daughter of Evenor. And he copulated with Cleito, a human woman. So this is a god inseminating a human female, and she gave birth to 5 sets of twin hybrid sons. Now, other ancient manuscripts that relate the Atlantis legend, such as there's a ancient Tibetan manuscript allegedly called the Book of Dizion that Helena Blavatsky references in her book, The Secret Doctrine, which describes the kings of Atlantis as giants. And that obviously syncs with the biblical narrative and more specifically the Book of Enoch. So you have these hybrid kings ruling over the rest of the human populace on these 7 islands and over the continents that they conquered. And it was what I call, it was an empire of the gods on planet Earth, in which the gods, each of them had divided the earth amongst themselves, and they were each of them ruling over their own little kingdom, established their own little kingdom, and produced their own hybrid progeny, who became the kings of their kingdoms. And this, I believe, was a global phenomenon, which would have meant that there would have been a universal civilization all over the earth with the basic knowledge, the same basic knowledge, the same basic technology. And I think that syncs with the megalith phenomenon that we see all over the earth, because the megaliths, the really large one, the really impressive ones, not Stonehenge and not some of these other smaller megaliths that could have been devised by primitive people. I'm talking about the really big ones, the really impressive megalithic constructions, the foundations of Baalbek, the walls of Sacsayhuaman, and so forth. And even in China, there's some absolutely mind-blowing megaliths in China that most people are not familiar with, and they all seem to share the same features. They all seem to have those nodules on them, and those nodules are sometimes inside of the structures, or not always on the outside of the blocks, which sort of negates the idea that they were placed there for certain things, certain features that would have been convenient on the outside of the blocks. There's all kinds of theories regarding those nodules. But the point is, you see the same kind of stuff, the same kind of cuts made in the rock all over the earth. It seems there seems to have been a ubiquitous technology that was being used to cut this hard rock. And so that bespeaks a universal civilization. And I think this notion of an empire of the gods solves that question of how it is that we have megaliths all over the earth that appear to have been made by the same civilization with the same technology. And that is, I don't know whether Atlantis is veritable history or not. I mean, it may be veritable history. Plato may have been relating the history of an actual city that existed in the antediluvian world. But at the very least, I'm convinced that Atlantis is an allegory of the golden age, Zeptepi, as the Egyptians called it, when the gods walked among men, the first time when the gods lived among men and copulated with their daughters and set up this empire.